In this ASMR episode, I will read for you Fantastic Mr. Fox, written by Roald Dahl, and I will interpret it for you in ASMR style. ASMR Katz. Did you hear that, Mr. Fox? It's not over yet. We are not going home till we are strung you up dead as a dingbat. Hello and welcome to my ASMR channel. My name is ASMR Katz and I'm a heavily tattooed girl who show you the satisfaction of sound. Right now, I'm on the project to read the full Roald Dahl collection. And he wrote books like Charlie and the Chocolate Fabric and Matilda. And if you are interested, then feel free to check yourself through my timeline, because there could be that I already upload a few books of him. But I also read a lot of other books before, so it is absolutely worth it to click yourself through my playlist and check out all the videos I have in stock for you. And when you ask yourself why all these microphones are here and this sound device, then I just can tell you it is here on purpose. You are right now on an ASMR channel, and I just can recommend you to put your headphones in your ear to get the quality in the fullest of power, because I have just the most important value here, and this is quality. Quality of sound. And you are maybe in a stressful world, maybe you are not able to sleep well, you are unrelaxed, you are out of power, then here is your private space to lean back, to enjoy, to just let it be. And if you are into reading and someone is reading a book for you, you are here right now at the right place. Okay, then let us start. Roald Dahl, Fantastic Mr. Fox. Illustrated by Quentin Blake. Introduction. Mr. Fox and Mrs. Fox, the small foxes, the badger, the bodges, the bean, and the buns. The three farmers. Down in the valley, there were 3 farmers. The owners of these farms had done well. They were rich men. They were also nasty men. All 3 of them were about as nasty and mean as any man you could meet. Their names were Farmer Boggis, Farmer Bunsy, and Farmer Bean. Boggis was a chicken farmer. He kept thousands of chickens. He was enormously fat. This was because he ate 3 boiled chickens smothered with dumplings every day before breakfast, lunch, and supper. Bounce was a duck and goose farmer. He kept thousands of ducks and geese. He was a kind of pot-bellied dwarf. He was so short his chin would have been under water in the shallow end of any swimming pool in the world. His food was donuts and goose livers. He mashed the livers into a disgusting paste and then stuffed the paste into the donuts. This diet gave him a tummy ache and bestial temper. Bean was a turkey and apple farmer. He kept thousands of turkeys in an orchard full of apple trees. He never ate any food at all. Instead, he drank gallons of strong cider, which he made from the apples in his orchard. He was as thin as a pencil and the cleverest of them all. Boggies and Bunsey and Bean, one fat and short and lean, this horrible crock so different in looks, were none less the equal mean. That is what the children round about used to sing when they saw them. Mr. Fox. On a hill above the valley there was a wood. In the wood there was a huge tree. Under the tree there was a hole. And in the hole lived Mrs. and Mr. Fox and their 4 small foxes. Every evening, as soon as it got dark, Mr. Fox would say to Mrs. Fox, "Well, my darling, what shall it be this time? A plump chicken from Boggies, a duck or goose from Buns, or a nice turkey from Bean?" And when Miss Fox has told him what she wanted, Mr. Fox would creep down into the valley in the dark on the night and help himself. Boggies and Buns and Bean knew very well what was going on, and it made them wild rage. They were not men who liked to give anything away, less still did they like anything to be stolen from them. So every night each one of them would take his shotgun and hide in the dark place somewhere on his farm, hoping to catch the robber. But Mr. Fox was too clever for them. He always approached a farm with the wind blowing in his face, and this meant that if any men were lurking in the shadows ahead, the wind would carry the smell of them to Fox nose from far away. Thus, if Mr. Boggies was hidden behind his chicken house number 1, Mr. Fox would smell him out from 50 yards off and quickly change direction, heading from the chicken house number 4 at the end of the farm. "Dang and blast the louse beast," cried Boggies. "I like to rip his guts out," said Bouncy. "He must be killed," cried Bean. "But how?" said Boggies. "How on earth can we catch the blighter?" Bean picked his nose delicate with a long finger. "I have a plan," he said. "You never had decent plan yet," said Buns. "Shut up and listen," said Bean. "Tomorrow night we will all hide just outside a hole where the fox lives. We will wait there until he comes out, and then bang." "Very clever," said Buns, "but first we shall have to find the hole." "My dear Buns, I've already found it," said the craft Bean. "It's up in the wood on the hill. It's under a huge tree." The shooting. "Well, my darling," said Mr. Fox, "what shall we eat tonight?" "I think we have a duck tonight," said Mrs. Fox. "Bring us 2 fat ducks, if you please. 1 for you and 1 for me, and 1 for the children." "Ducks it shall be," said Mr. Fox. "Buns bests." "Now do be careful," said Mrs. Fox, "my darling." Mr. Fox said, "I can smell those guns a mile away. I can even smell one from the other. Boggies gives off a filthy stink of rotten chicken skin. Bunsey reeks of goosey livers, and as for Bean, the fumes of apple cider hanging around him like poisonous gases." "Yes, but just don't get careless," said Mrs. Fox. "You know they will be waiting for you, all 3 of them." "Don't you worry about me," said Mr. Fox. "I will see you later." But Mr. Fox would not have been quite so cocky had he known exactly where the 3 farmers were waiting at the moment. They were just outside the entrance to the hole, each one crouching behind a tree with guns loaded. And what is more, they had chosen their position very carefully, making sure that the wind was not blowing from them toward the fox. In fact, it was blowing in the opposite direction. There was no chance of them being smelled out. Mr. Fox creeped up the dark tunnel to the mouth of his hole. He poked his long, handsome face out into the night air and sniffed once. He moved an inch or two forward and stopped. He sniffed again. He was always especially careful when coming out from his hole. He inched forward a little more. The front half of his body was now in the open. His black nose twitched from the side to side, sniffling and sniffless for the safe scent of danger. He found none, and he was just about to trotting forward into the wood when he thought he heard a tiny noise, a soft rustling sound, as though someone had moved a foot ever so gently through a patch of dry leaves. Mr. Fox flattened his body against the ground and lay very still, his ears pricked. He waited a long time, but he heard nothing more. It must have been a field mouse, he told himself, or some other small animal. He crept a little further out of the hole, then further still. He was almost right out in the open now. He took a last careful look around. The wood was murky and very still. Somewhere in the sky the moon was shining. Just then his sharp night eyes caught a glint of something bright behind a tree not far away. It was a small silver speck, moonlight shining on a polished surface. Mr. Fox lay still watching it. What on earth was it? Now, it was moving. It was coming up and up. Great heaven! It was the barrel of a gun. Quick as a whip, Mr. Fox jumped back into this hole, and at this same instant the entire wood seemed to explode around him. The smoke from the guns floated upward in the night air. Bang! Bang, bang. Boogies and Buns and Bean came out from behind their trees and walked towards the hole. Did we get him? Said Bean. One of them shone a flashlight on the hole, and there, on the ground in the circle of light, half and half out of the hole, lay the poor terrible blood-stained remains of Fox's tail. Bean picked it up. We got the tail, but we missed the fox, he said, tossing the thing away. There was no food for the foxes that night, and soon the children dozed off. Then Mrs. Fox dozed off, but Mr. Fox couldn't sleep because of the pain of the stump of his tail. Well, he thought, I suppose I'm lucky to be alive at all. And now they found our hole. We're going to have to move as soon as possible. We never get any peace here, Phil. What is that? He turned his head sharply and listened. The noise he heard now was the most frightening noise a fox can ever hear. The scrabbing of shovels digging into the soil. Wake up, he shouted. They are digging us out. Mrs. Fox was wide awake in a second. She sat up, quivering all over. Are you sure that this is it? She whispered. I'm positive, listen. They kill my children, cried Mrs. Fox. Never, said Mr. Fox. But darling, they will, sobbed Mrs. Fox. You know they will. Scrunch, 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 went the shovels above their heads. Small stones and bits of earth began falling from the roof of the tunnel. How will they kill us, Mummy? Asked one of the small foxes. His round black eyes were huge with fright. Will there be dogs? He said. Mrs. Fox began to cry. She gathered her 4 children close to her and held them tight. Suddenly, there was an especially loud crunch about their heads, and the sharp end of the shovels came right out the ceiling. The sight of this awful thing seemed to have an electric effect upon Mr. Fox. He jumped up and shouted, "I've got it! Come on, there's a moment to lose. We didn't, I think it before." "Think of what, Dad?" "A fox can dig quicker than a man," shouted Mr. Fox, beginning to dig. "Nobody in the world can dig as quick as a fox." The soil began to fly out furiously behind Mr. Fox as he started to dig for dear life with his front feet. Mrs. Fox ran forward to help him. So did the 4 children. "Go downwards," ordered Mr. Fox. "We've got to go deep as we possibly can." The tunnel began to grow longer and longer. It sloped downward. Deeper and deeper below the surface of the ground it went. The mother and the father and all 4 of the children were digging together. Their front legs were moving so fast you couldn't see them, and gradually the scrunching and scraping of the shovels became fainter and fainter. After about an hour, Mr. Fox stopped digging. "Hold it," he said. They all stopped. They turned and looked back up the long tunnel they had just dug. All was quiet. "Phew," said Mr. Fox. "I think we've done it. They'll never get as deep as this. Well done, everyone." They all sat down, panting for breath, and Mrs. Fox said to the children, "I should like you to know that if it wasn't for your father, we should all be dead by now. Your father is fantastic, Fox." Mr. Fox looked at his wife and she smiled. He loved her more than ever when he said things like that. The terrible tractors. As soon as the sun rose the next morning, Boggies and Bounce and Bean were still digging. They had dug a hole so deep you could have put a house into it. But they had not yet came to the end of the foxes. They were all very tired and cross. "Dang and blast," said Boggies. "Whose rotten idea was this?" "Bean's idea," said Buns. Boogies and Buns both started at Bean. Bean took another swig of cider, then put the flask back into his pocket without offering it to the others. "Listen," he said angrily, "I want that fox. I'm going to get that fox. I'm not giving in till I've strung him up over the front porch dead as a dumpling." "We can't get him by digging, that for sure," said the fat Boggies. "I've had enough of digging." Buns, the little pot-bellied dwarf, looked up at Bean and said, "Have you got any more stupid ideas then?" "What?" said Bean. "I can't hear you." Bean never took a bath. He never even washed. As a result, his ear holes were clogged with all kinds of muck and wax and bits of chewing gum and dead flies and stuff like that. This made him deaf. "Speak louder," he said to Buns, and Buns shouted back, "Got any more stupid ideas?" Bean rubbed the back of his neck with a dirty finger. He had boil coming there and it itched. "What we need on this job," he said, "is machines. Mechanical shovels. We have him out in the 5 minutes with mechanical showers." This was a pretty good idea, and the other 2 had to admit it. "All right then," Bean said, taking charge. "Boogies, you stay here and see the fox doesn't escape. Buns and I will go and fetch our machinery. If he tries to get out, shoot him quick." The long, thin Bean walked away. The tiny Buns trotted after him. The fat Boggy stayed where he was with his gun pointing at the foxhole. Soon 2 enormous caterpillar tractors with mechanical shovels on their front came clanking into the wood. Bean was driving one, Buns the other. The machines were both black. They were murderous, brutal-looking monsters. "Here we go then," shouted Bean. "Death to the fox," shouted Buns. The machines went to work, biting huge mouthfuls of soil out of the hill. The big trees under which Mr. Fox had dug his hole in the first place was toppled like a majestic. On all sides, rocks were sent flying and trees were flying, and the noise was deafening. Down in the tunnel, the foxes crouched, listening to terrible clanging and banging and overhead. "What's happening, Dad?" cried the small foxes. "What are they doing?" Mr. Fox didn't know what was happening or what they were doing. "It's an earthquake," cried Mrs. Fox. "Look," said one of the smallest foxes. Our tunnels get shorter. I can see daylight." They all looked around, and yes, the mouth of the tunnel was only a few feet away from them now, and in the circle of daylight beyond, they could see the two huge black tractors almost on top of them. "Tractors," shouted Mr. Fox, "and mechanical showers. Dig for your lives. Dig!" The race. Now there began a desperate race. The machines against the foxes. In the beginning, the hill looked like this. After about an hour, as the machines bite away more and more soil from the hilltop, it looked like this. Sometimes the foxes would gain a little ground and the clanking noises would grow fainter, and Mr. Fox would say, "We are going to make it, I'm sure we are." But then a few moments later, the machines would come back and the crunch of the mighty shovels would get louder and louder. Once the foxes actually saw the sharp metal edge of one of the shovels as it scraped up the earth just behind them. "Keep up going, my darlings," panted Mr. Fox. "Don't give up. Keep going." The fat boggies shouted to Buns and Bean. "We get him any moment now." "Have you caught sight of him yet?" Bean called back. "Not yet," shouted Boggies, "but I think you're close." "I will pick him up with my bucket," shouted Bounce. "I'll chop him to pieces." But by lunchtime the machines were still at it, and so were the poor foxes. The hill now looked like this. The farmers didn't stop for lunch. They were too keen to finish the job. "Hey there, Mr. Fox," yelled Buns, leaning out of his tractor. "We are coming to get you now." "You had your last chicken," yelled Boggies. "You never come brawling around my farm again." A sort of madness had taken hold of the three men. The tall, skinny Bean and Washpot Bounce were driving their machines like maniacs, racing the motors and making the shovels dig at a terrific speed. The fat Boggies was hopping about like a dervish and shouting, "Faster!" By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, this is what happened to the hill. The hole the machines had dug was like the crater of a volcano. It was such an extraordinary sight that crowds of people came rushing out from the surrounding village to have a look. They stood on the edge of the crater and stared down in Boggy and Bouncy and Bean. "Hey there, Boggies, what's going on?" "We are after the foxes." "You must be mad," the people jeered and laughed. But this only made the three farmers more furious and more obstinate and more determined than ever not to give up until they have caught the fox. We never let him go. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Bean switched off the motor of his tractor and climbed down from the driver's seat. Buns did the same. Both men had enough. They were tired and stiff from driving the tractors all day. They were also hungry. Slowly they walked over the small fox's hole in the bottom of the huge crater. Bean's face was purple with rage. Buns was curling the fox with dirty words that could not be printed. Boogies came waddling up. "Dang and blast that filthy stink fox," he said. "What the heck do we do now?" "I tell you what we don't do," Bean said. "We don't let him out. We'll never let him go. Never, never, never." "Did you hear that, Mr. Fox?" yelled Bean, bending low and shouting down the hole. "It's not over yet, Mr. Fox. We are not going home till we are strong you up as a dingbat." Whereupon the three men all shook hands with another and swore a solemn oath that they would not go back to their farms until the fox was caught. "So, what's our next move?" asked Buns, the pot-bellied dwarf. "We are sending you down the hole to fetch him up," said Bean. "Down you go, you miserable midget." "Not me," screamed Bounce, running away. Bean made a sick smile when he smiled. You saw his scarlet gums. You saw more gums than teeth. "Then there's only one thing to do," he said. "We starve him out. We camp here day and night watching the hole. He will come out in the end. He have to." So Buggies and Buns and Bean sent messages down to the farms asking for tents, sleeping bags, and super. The foxes begin to starve. That evening, 3 tents were put up in the crater in the hill. 1 for Buggies, 1 for Buns, and 1 for Bean. The tents surrounded Mr. Fox's hole, and the 3 farmers sat outside their tents eating their super. Buggies had 3 boiled chickens smothered in dumplings. Buns had 6 donuts filled with disgusting goosey liver past, and Bean had 2 gallons of cider. All 3 of them kept their guns beside them. Buggies picked up steaming chicken and held it close to the fox hole. "Can you smell this, Mr. Fox?" he shouted. "Lovely tender chicken. Why don't you come up and get it?" The rich scent of chicken wafted down to the tunnel where the foxes were crouching. "Oh, Dad," said one of the small foxes, "couldn't we just sneak up and snatch it out of his hand?" "Don't you dare," said Mrs. Fox. "That's just what they want to do." "But we are so hungry," they cried. "How long will it be till we get some to eat?" Their mother didn't answer them, nor did their father. There was no answer to give. As darkness fell, Buns and Bean switched on the powerful headlamps of the 2 tractors and shone them on the hole. "Now," said Bean, "we take it in turn to keep watch. 1 watches while 2 sleeps, and so on all through the night." Boogie said, "What if the fox digs a hole right through the hill and comes out to the other side?" "You didn't think of that one, did you?" "Of course I did," said Bean, pretending he had. "Go on, then tell us the answer," said Boogies. Bean picked something small and black out of his ears and flicked it away. "How many men you have to go working on your farm?" he asked. 35, Buggies said. "I've got 36, Buns said. "And I've got 37, Bean said. "That makes 108 men altogether. We must order them surrounded the hill. Each man will have a gun and a flashlight. There will be no escape then for Mrs. Fox." So the order went down to the farms, and the night 108 men formed a tight ring around the bottom of the hill. They were armed with sticks and guns and hatchets and pistols and all sorts of other horrible weapons. This made it quite impossible for a fox or indeed for any other animal to escape from the hill. The next day, the watching and waiting went on. Boogies and Buns and Bean sat upon a small stool staring at this hole. They didn't talk much. They just sat there with their guns on their laps. Every so often, Mr. Fox would creep a little closer toward the mouth of the tunnel and take a sniff. Then he would creep back again and say, "They're still here." "Are you quite sure?" Mrs. Fox would ask. "Positive," said Mr. Fox. "I can smell that Bean a mile away. He stinks." Mr. Fox has a plan. For 3 days and 3 nights, this waiting game went on. How long can a fox go without food or water? Buggies asked on the 3rd day. Not much longer, Bean told him. He'll make a run for it soon. He will have to. Bean was right. Down in the tunnel, the foxes were slowly but surely starving to death. "If only we could have just a tiny sip of water," said one of the smart foxes. "Oh, Dad, can't you don't go and do something? Couldn't we make a dash for it, Dad? We would have a little bit of chance, wouldn't we?" "No chance at all," snapped the Mr. Fox. "I refuse to let you go up there and face those guns. It's sooner just stay down here and die in peace." Mr. Fox had not spoken for a long time. He had been sitting quite still, his eyes closed, not even hearing what the others were saying. Mrs. Fox knew that he was trying desperately to think of a way out. And now, as she looked at him, she saw him steer himself and get slowly to his feet. He looked back at his wife. There was a little spark of excitement dancing in his eyes. "What is it, darling?" said Mrs. Fox quickly. "I've just had a bit of an idea," Mr. Fox said carefully. "What?" "Oh, Dad, what is it?" "Come on," said Mrs. Fox, "tell us." "Well," said Mr. Fox. Then he stopped and sighed sadly, shook his head. He sat down again. "It's not good," he said. "It won't work after all." "Why not, Dad?" "Because it's mean more digging, and we aren't any of us strong enough for that of 3 days and nights without food." "Yes, we are, Dad," cried the small foxes, jumping up and running to their father. "We can do it." "You see if we can't, so can you?" Mr. Fox looked at the 4 small foxes and he smiled. "What fine children I have," he thought. "They are starving to death and they haven't had a drink for 3 days, but they're still undefeated. I must not let them down. I suppose we could give it a try," he said. "Let's go, Dad. Tell us what you want yours to do." Slowly, Mrs. Fox got to her feet. She was suffering more than any of them from the lack of food and water. She was very weak. "I'm so sorry," she said, "but I don't think I'm going to be much help." "You stay right where you are, my darling," said Mr. Fox. "We can handle this by ourselves." Boogie's Chicken House number 1. "This time we must go in a very special direction," said Mr. Fox, pointing sideways and downward. So he and his 4 children started to dig once again. The work went much more slowly now, yet they kept at it with great courage, and a little by little tunnel began to grow. "Dad, I wish you would tell us where we are going," said one of the children. "I dare not that," said Mr. Fox, "because this place I am hoping to get is so marvelous that I've described it for you now. You would go crazy with excitement. And then if we fail to get there, which is very possible, you would die of disappointment. I don't want to raise your hopes too much, my darlings." For a long, long time they kept on digging. For how long they did not know, because there were no days and no nights down there in the murky tunnel. But at last Mr. Fox gave the order to stop. "I think," he said, "we had better take a peep upstairs now and see where we are. I know where I want to be, but I can't possibly be sure we are anywhere near it." Slowly, warily the foxes began to slope the tunnel up towards the surface. Up and up it went, until suddenly they came to something hard above their heads, and they couldn't go up any farther. Mr. Fox reached up to examine this hard thing. It was wood. Wooden planks. What does it mean, Dad? "It means, unless I am very much mistaken, that we are right underneath somebody's house," whispered Mr. Fox. "Be very quiet now while I take a peek." Carefully, Mr. Fox began pushing up one of the floorboards. The board cracked most terrible, and they all ducked down, waiting for something awful to happen. Nothing did. So Mr. Fox pushed up a second board, and then, very, very cautiously, he poked his head up through the scape. He let out a shriek of excitement. "I've done it," he yelled. "I've done it. First time, I've done it." He pulled himself up through the gap in the floor and started prancing and dancing with joy. "Come up," he sang out. "Come up and see where we are, my darlings. What a sight for a hungry fox. Hallelujah!" The 4 small foxes scrambled up out the tunnel, and what a fantastic sight it was that now met their eyes. They were in a huge shed, and the whole place was teeming with chickens. There were white chickens and brown chickens, and black chickens by the thousand. "Boggy's chicken house number 1, cried Mr. Fox. "Exactly what was aiming it. I hit it slap in the middle, first time. Isn't that fantastic? And if I may say, they're rather clever." The small foxes went wild with excitement. They started running around in all directions, chasing the stupid chickens. "Wait," ordered Mr. Fox. "Don't lose your heads. Stand back, calm down. Let's do this properly. First of all, everyone have a drink of water." They all ran over to the chickens, drinking through and lapped up the lovely color water. Then Mr. Fox chose 3 of the plumpest hens, and with a clever flick of his jaws, he killed them instantly. "Back to the tunnel," he ordered. "Come on. No fooling around. The quicker you move, the quicker you shall have something to eat." One after another, they climbed down through the hole in the floor, and soon they were all standing once again in the dark tunnel. Mr. Fox reached up and pulled the floorboard back into place. He did this with great care. He did it so that no one could tell that they had ever been moved. "My son," he said, giving the 3 plump hens to the biggest of his 4 small children, "run back with these to your mother. Tell you to prepare a feast. Tell her the rest of us will be along in jiffy as soon as we have made a few other little arrangements." A surprise for Mrs. Fox. The small fox ran back along the tunnel as fast as he could, carrying the 3 plump hens. He was exploding with joy. "Just wait," he kept thinking. "Just wait till Mommy sees this." He had a long way to run, but he never stopped once on the way, and he came bursting in upon Mrs. Fox. "Mommy," he cried. "Look, Mommy, look. Wake up and see what I have brought for you." Mrs. Fox, who was weaker than ever, now from look of foot, opened one eye and looked at her hands. "I'm dreaming," she murmured, and closed the eye again. You're not dreaming, Mommy. They are real chickens. We are saved." "We are not going to starve." Mrs. Fox opened both eyes and sat up quickly. "But my dear child," she cried, "where on earth?" Boggy's chicken house number 1, spluttered the small fox. We tunneled right up under the floor, and you never seen so many big fat hens in all of your life. And Dad said to prepare a feast. They will be back soon. The sight of food seemed to give new strength to Mrs. Fox. A feast it shall be, she said, standing up. Oh, what a fantastic fox your father is. Hurry up, child, and start plucking those chickens. Far away down the tunnel, the fantastic Mr. Fox was saying, Now, for the next bit, my darlings. This one will be easy as a pie. All we have to do is dig another little tunnel from here to there. To where, Dad? Don't ask me questions. Start digging. Badger. Mr. Fox and the 3 remaining small foxes dug fast and straight. They were all too excited now to feel tired or hungry. They knew they were going to have a whacking great feast before long, and the fact that this was none other than Boggy's chickens they were going to eat made them joggle with laughter. Every time they thought of it, it was lovely to realize that while the fat farmer was sitting up there on the hill waiting for them to starve, he was also giving them their dinner without knowing it. Keep digging, said Mr. Fox. It's not much further. All of a sudden, a deep voice above their heads said, Who goes there? The foxes jumped. They looked up quickly, and they saw peeking through a small hole in the roof of a tunnel a long black pointed furry face. Badger, cried Mr. Fox. Foxy, cried Badger. My goodness, I'm so glad I found someone at least. I've been digging around in circles for 3 days and nights, and I haven't the foggiest idea where I am. Badger made the hole in the ceiling bigger and dropped down beside the fox. A small badger, his son, dropped down after him. Haven't you heard what's happening up on the hill? Badger said excitedly. It's chaos. Half the wood has disappeared, and there are men with guns all over the countryside. None of us can get out, even at night. We are starving to death. Who is we? Asked Mr. Fox. All us diggers. That's me, and Mole, and Rabbit, and all our wives and children. Even Weasel, who can usually sneak out the tightest spot, is right now hidden down my hole with Mr. Weasel and 6 kids. What on earth are we going to do, Foxy? I think we are finished. Mr. Fox looked at the 3 children and smiled. The children smiled back at him, sharing his secret. My dear old Badger, he said, this mess you are in is all my fault. I know it's your fault, said the Badger furiously, and the farmers are not going to give up till they got you. Unfortunately, they mean us as well. It means everyone in the hill. Badger sat down and put a paw around his small son. We are done for, she said softly. My poor wife up there is weak. She can't dig another yard. Nor care mine, said Mr. Fox. And yes, at this very minute she is preparing for me and my children the most delicious feast of a plum-juiced chicken. Stop, cried Badger. Don't tease me. I can't stand it. It's true, cried the small foxes. Dad's not teasing. We got chicken's gallery. And because everything is entirely my fault, said Mr. Fox, I invite you to share the feast. I invite everyone to share it. You and Mole and Rabbit and Weasel and all your wives and children. There are all plenty to go around, I can assure you. You mean it? Cried Badger. You really mean it? Mr. Fox pushed his face close to Badger's and whispered darkly. Do you know where we just been? Where? Right inside Boggy's chicken house number 1. No. Yes, but that is nothing to where we are going now. You have come just at the right moment, my dear Badger. You can help us dig, and in the meanwhile your small son can run back to Mrs. Badger and all the others and spread the good news." Mr. Fox turned the small badger and said, "Tell them they are all invited to a fox feast. Then bring them all down here on the follow this tunnel back until you find my home." "Yes, Mr. Fox," said the small badger. "Yes, sir." "Right away, sir." "Oh, thank you, sir." And he scrambled quickly back through the hole in the roof of the tunnel and disappeared. Bounce Giant Storehouse. "My dear Foxy," cried Badger, "what in the world has happened to your tail?" "Don't talk about it, please," said Mr. Fox. "It's a painful subject." They were digging the new tunnel. They dug in silence. Badger was a great digger, and the tunnel went forward at a terrific pace, now that he was lending a paw. Soon they were crouching underneath yet another wooden floor. Mr. Fox grinned slowly, showing sharp with his teeth. "If I am not mistaken, my dear Badger," he said, "we are now underneath a farm which belongs to that nasty little pot. We are in fact directly underneath the most interesting part of the farm. Ducks and geese," cried the small fox. "Juicy, tender ducks and big fat geese." "Exactly," said Mr. Fox. "But how in the world can you know where we are?" asked Badger. Mr. Fox grinned again, showing even more white teeth. "Look," he said, "I know my way around this farm's blindfold. For me, it's just as easy below ground as it is above it." He reached high and pushed up one wooden floorboard, then another. He poked his head through the gap. "Yes," he shouted, jumping up into the room above. "I've done it again. I hit it smack on the nose, right in the bully's eye. Come and look." Quickly, Badger and the three small foxes scrambled up after him. They stopped and stared. They stood and gaped. They were so overwhelmed they couldn't speak, for what they now saw was a kind of fox dream. A badger's dream, a paradise for hungry animals. "This, my dear old badger, Mr. Fox, is Bunce's mighty storehouse. All his finest stuff is stored in here before he sent it off to the market. Against all the four walls of great rooms stacked in cupboards and piled upon shelves reaching from floor to ceiling, were thousands and thousands of the finest and fattest ducks and geese plucked and ready for roasting. And up above, dangling from the rafters, there must have been at least 100 smoked hams and 50 sides of bacon. Just feast your eyes on that," cried Mr. Fox, dancing up and down. "What do you think of it? Pretty good, huh?" Suddenly, as though springs had been released in their legs, the three hungry small foxes and the ravenously hungry badger sprang forward to grab the luscious food. "Stop," ordered Mr. Fox. "This is my party, so I shall do the choosing." The others fell back, licking their chops. Mr. Fox began prowling around the storehouse, examining the glorious display with an expert eye. A thread of salvia slid down on side of his jaw and hung suspended in midair, then snapped. "We mustn't overdo it," he said. "Mustn't give the game away. Mustn't let them know what we've been up to. We must be neat and tidy and take just a few of the choicest morsels. So to start with, we shall have 4 plump young ducks." He looked to them from the shelf. "Oh, how lovely and fat they are. No wonder Bunsey gets a special price for them in the market." "All right, Badger, lend me a hand to get them down." Your children can help as well. There we go. Goodness me, look how your mouths are watering. And now I think we had better have a few G's. 3 will be quite enough. We will take the biggest. Oh my, you never see finger G's than this in King's kitchen. Gentle does it. That's the way. And what about a couple of nice smoked hams? I adore a smoked ham, don't you, Badger? Fetch me that step ladder, will you please? Mr. Fox climbed up the ladder and handed down 3 magnificent hams. And do you like bacon, Badger? I'm mad about bacon, cried Badger, dancing with excitement. Let's have a side of bacon, that big one up there. And carrots, Dad, said the smallest of the 3 smallest foxes. We must take some of those carrots. Don't be a twerp, said Mr. Fox. You know we never eat things like that. It's not for us, Dad. It's for the rabbits. They only eat vegetables. My goodness, you are right. What a thoughtful little fellow you are. Take 10 bunches of carrots. Soon all this lovely loot was laying in a net heap upon the floor. The small foxes crouched close, their noses twitching, their eyes shining like stars. And now, said Mr. Fox, we shall have to borrow from our friend Buns 2 of those useful push carts over in the corner. He and Badger fetched the push carts, and the ducks and geese and hams and bacon were loaded on them. Quickly, the push carts were lowered through the hole in the floor. The animals slid down after them, back in the tunnel. Mr. Fox again pulled the floorboarders very carefully into place, so that one could see they had been moved. My darlings, he said, pointing to the 2 of the 3 small foxes. Take care, a cart each, and run back as fast as you can to your mother. Give her my love and tell her we are having guests for dinner. The badgers, the moles and the rabbits and the weasels, tell her it must be a truly great feast, and tell her the rest of us will be home as soon as we done one more little job. Yes, Dad, right away. They answered, and they grabbed the trolley each and went rushing out down the hill. Badger has doubts. Just one more visit, cried Mr. Fox, and I be know where they be, said the only small fox now left. He was the smallest fox of them. Where? asked Badger. Well, said the smallest fox, we been to Boggies and we been to Buns, but we haven't been to Bean. It must be. You are right, said Mr. Fox, but what you don't know is which part of Bean's place we are about to visit. Which? They said both together. Ah, said Mr. Fox, just you wait and see. They were digging as they talked. The tunnel was going forward fast. Suddenly, Badger said, Doesn't this worry you just a tiny bit, Foxy? Worry me? What? All this? The ceiling? Mr. Fox stopped digging and started Badger and thought he had gone completely dotty. My dear old furry frump, he said, do you know anyone in the whole world who wouldn't swipe a few chickens if his children were starving to death? There was a short silence where Badger thought deeply about this. You are far too respectable, said Mr. Fox. There's nothing wrong with being respectable, Badger said. Look, said Mr. Fox, Botchies and Bunsy and Bean are to kill us. You realize that, I hope. I do, Fox, I do indeed, said the gentle Badger, but we are not going to stop their level. We don't want to kill them. It should hope not indeed, said Badger. We wouldn't dream of it, said Mr. Fox. We shall simply talk a little food here and there to keep us and more families alive, right? I suppose we have to, said Badger. If they want to be horrible, let them. We down here and decent peace-loving people. Badger laid his head on one side and smiled to Mr. Fox. "Foxy," he said, "I love you." "Thank you," said Mr. Fox. "And now let's get on with the digging." 5 minutes later, Badger's front paws hit against something flat and hard. "What on earth is this?" he said. "It looks like a solid stone." He and Mr. Fox scared away the soil. It was a wall. But it was built of bricks, not stones. The wall was right in front of them, blocking their way. "Now, who in the world would build a wall under the ground?" asked Badger. "Very simple," said Mr. Fox. "It's the wall of an underground room, and if I'm not mistaken, it is exactly what I'm looking for." Bean's Sacred Cider Cellar. Mr. Fox examined the wall carefully. He saw that the cement between the bricks was old and crumbly, so he loosened a brick without much trouble and pulled it away. Suddenly, out from the hole where the brick has been, there popped a small, sharp face with whiskers. "Go away," it snapped. "You can come in here. It's private." "Good Lord," said Badger. "It's a rat." "You sauce beast," said Mr. Fox. "I should have guessed we find you down here somewhere." "Go away," shrieked the rat. "Go on, beat it. This is my private pitch." "Shut up," said Mr. Fox. "I will not shut up," shrieked the rat. "This is my place. I got here first." Mr. Fox gave a brilliant smile, flashing his white teeth. "My dear rat," he said softly, "I am a hungry fellow, and if you don't hop quickly, I shall eat you up in one gulp." That did it. The rat popped back fast out of sight. Mr. Fox laughed and began pulling more bricks out of the wall. When he had made a biggish hole, he crept through it. Badger and Smallest Fox followed him. They found themselves in a vast, damp, gloomy cellar. "This is it," cried Mr. Fox. "This is what?" said Badger. "The place is empty. Where are the turkeys?" "I thought Bean was a turkey man." "He is a turkey man," said Mr. Fox, "but we are not after the turkeys now. We got plenty of food." "Then what do we need, Dad?" "Take a look around," said Mr. Fox. "Don't you see anything interesting here?" Badger and the Smallest Fox peered into the half-darken. As their eyes became accustomed to the gloom, they began to see what looked like a whole lot of big glass jars standing upon shelves around the walls. They went closer. They were jars. There were 100 of them, and upon each one was written the word cider. The Smallest Fox leapt. "Oh, Dad, look what I found. It's cider." "Exactly," said Mr. Fox. "Tremendous," shouted the Badger. "Bean's Secret Cider Cellar," said Mr. Fox. "But go carefully, my dears. Don't make a noise. This cellar is right underneath the farmer's house itself." "Cider," said Badger, "is especially good for badgers. We take it as medicine, on large glass 3 times a day with meals and another at bedtime. It will make the feast into a banquet," said Mr. Fox. While they were talking, the Smallest Fox had sneaked a jar off the shelf and had taken gulp. "Wow," he gasped. "You must understand, this was not the ordinary weak, fizzy cider one buys in store. It was the real stuff, a home-brewed fire liquor that burned in your throat and boiled your stomach." "Ah," gasped the small fox, This is some cider?" "This, quite enough of that," said Mr. Fox, grabbing the jar and putting it on his lips. He took a tremendous gulp. "It's miraculous," he whispered, fighting for breath. "It's fabulous. It's beautiful." "It's my turn," said the Badger, taking a jar and tittling his head well back. The cider gurgled and bulbed down his throat. It is like melted gold," he gasped. Oh, Fox, it's like drink sunbeams and rainbows. You are poaching, shrieked Red. But that down at once. There be none left for me. Red was perched upon the highest shelf on the cellar, peering out from behind a huge jar. There was a small rubber tube inserted in the neck of the jar, and the Red was using this tube to suck out the cider. You are drunk, said Mr. Fox. Mind your own business, shrieked the Red, and if your great clumsy protest comes messing about in here, we'll be bad caught. Get out and leave me to sip in my cider in peace. At the moment, they heard a woman's voice calling out in the house above them. Hurry up and get the cider, Marble, the voice called. You know Mr. Bean doesn't like to keep waiting, especially when he was been out all night in a tent. The animals froze. They stayed absolutely still, their ears pricked, their bodies tense. Then they heard the sound of the door being opened. The door was at the top of the flight of stone steps leading down from the house to the cellar. And now someone was staring at coming down to those steps. The woman. Quick, said Mr. Fox, hide. He and Badger and the smallest fox jumped up on the shelf and crushed behind a row of big cider jars. Peering around the jars, they saw a huge woman coming down to the cellar. At the foot of the steps, the woman paused, looking to right and left. Then she turned and headed straight for the place where Mr. Fox and Badger and the smallest fox were hidden. She stopped right in front of them. The only thing between her and them was a ride of cider jars. She was so close, Mr. Fox could hear the sound of her breathing. Peeping through the crack between the bottles, he noticed that she carried a big rolling pin on her hand. How many will we want to have this time, Mrs. Bean? The woman shouted, and from the top of the step, another voice called back, Bring off 2 or 3 jars. He drank 4 yesterday, Mrs. Bean. Yes, but he won that one today because he's not going to be up there more than a few hours longer. He says the fox is bound to make a run for it this morning. I can't possibly stay down that hole another day without food. The woman in the cellar reached out and lifted a jar of cider from the shelves. The jar she took was next, but on the jar behind which was Mr. Fox encroaching. I'll be glad when the rotten brute is killed and strung up in the front porch, she called out. And by the way, Mrs. Bean, your husband promised I could have the tail as a souvenir. The tail's been all shot to pieces, said the voice from upstairs. Didn't you know that? You mean it's ruined? Of course it ruins. They shot the tail but missed the fox. Oh, husk, said the big woman. It did so want that tail. You can have the head instead, Mabel. You can get it stuffed and hang it on your bedroom wall. Hurry up now with the cider. Yes, ma'am, I'm coming, said the big woman, and she took a second jar from the shelf. If she takes one more, she'll see us, thought Mr. Fox. He could feel the smallest fox body pressed like against his own, quivering for excitement. Will 2 be enough, Mrs. Bean, or shall I take 3? My goodness, Mabel, I don't care so long as you get a move on. Then 2 it is, said the huge woman, speaking to herself. He drinks too much anyway. Carrying a jar in each hand and with a rolling pin tucked under one arm, she walked away across the cellar. At the foot of the steps, she paused and looked around, sniffing the air. There's rats down here again, Mrs. Bean. I can smell them. Then, poison them, woman, poison them. You know where the poison is kept. Yes, Mayhem. She climbed slowly out of the side up the steps. The door slammed. "Quickly," said Mr. Fox, "grab a jar each and run for it." Red stood on his high shelf and shrieked, "What did I tell you? You nearly got nabbed, didn't you? You now on. I don't want you around. This is my place." "You," said Mr. Fox, "and going to be poisoned." "Poppycock," said Red. "I sit up here and watch her putting the stuff down. She never get me." Mr. Fox and Badger and the smallest fox run across the cellar, catching a gallon jar each. "Goodbye, Red," they called out as they disappeared through the hole in the wall. "Thanks for the love cider." "Thief," shrieked the Red. "Robbers and bandits." The Great Feast. Back in the tunnel, they paused so that Mr. Fox could bring up the hole in the wall. He was humming to himself as he put the bricks back in place. "I can taste the glorious cider," he said. "What an impudent fellow Red is." "He has bad manners," Badger said. "All rats have bad manners. I've never met a polite rat yet." "And he drinks too much," said Mr. Fox, putting the last brick in place. "There we are. Now, home to the feast." They grabbed the jars of cider and off they went. Mr. Fox was in front of the smallest fox, came next and badged last. Along the tunnel they flew, past the turning that they led Bounce Mite's storehouse. "Keep it up, my darlings," shouted Mr. Fox. "We soon be there. Think what was waiting for us that other end. And just think what we are bringing home with us in the jars. That ought to cheer up poor Mrs. Fox." Mr. Fox sang a little song and he ran. "Home again swiftly I glide, back to my beautiful bride. She'll not well feel so rotten as she's gotten some cider inside her inside." The Badger joined. "Oh, poor Miss Badger. He cried so hungry she never died. But shall not feel so hollow if only she swallow some cider inside her inside." They were still singing as they rounded the final corner and burst in upon this most wonderful and amazing sight any of them had ever seen. The feast was beginning. A large dining room had been hollowed out of the earth. In the middle of it, seated around a huge table, were no less than 29 animals. They were Mrs. Fox and the small foxes, Mrs. Badger and the 3 small badgers, Mole and Mrs. Mole, Rabbit and Mrs. Rabbit, and 5 small rabbits, Weasel and Mrs. Weasel, and 6 small weasels. The table was covered with chicken and ducks and geese and hams and bacon, and everyone was tucking into a lovely food. "My darling," cried Mr. Fox, jumping up and hugging Mrs. Fox. "We couldn't wait. Please forgive us." Then she hugged the smallest fox of all, and Mrs. Badger hugged Badger, and everyone hugged everyone else. Amid shouts of joy, the great jars of cider were placed upon the table, and Mr. Fox and Badger and the smallest fox sat down with their others. You must remember no one had eaten a thing for several days. There were revenges. So for a while there was no conversion at all. There was only the sound of crunching and chewing as the animals attacked the succulent food. At least Badger stood up. He raised his glass of cider and called out, "A toast! I want you all to stand and drink a toast to our dear friend who have saved our lives this day, Mr. Fox." "To Mr. Fox," they shouted, standing up and raising their glasses. Then Mrs. Fox got shyly to her feet and said, I don't want to make a speech. I just want to say one thing, and it is this. My husband is a fantastic fox. Everyone cleared up and cheered. Then Mr. Fox himself stood up. This delicious meal, he began, then he stopped. In the silence that followed, he let fly a tremendous bleach. There was a laughter and more clapping. The delicious meal, my friends, he went on, is by courtesy of Mother Boggy's Bounce and Bean. More cheering and laughter. And I hope you have enjoyed as much as I have. He let fly another colossal belch. Better out than in, said Badger. Thank you, said Mr. Fox, grinning hugely. But now, my friends, let us be serious. Let us think of tomorrow and the next day and the days after that. If we got out, we will be killed, right? Right, they shouted. We'll be shot before we go in the yard, said Badger. Exactly, said Mr. Fox. But who wants to go out anyway? Let me ask you that. We are all diggers, every one of us. We hate the outside. The outside is full of enemies. We only go out because we have to go out for our families. But now, my friends, we have an entirely new setup. We have a safe tunnel leading to the 3 finest stores in the world. We do indeed, said Badger. I've seen them. And you know what this means, said Mr. Fox? It means that none of us need ever go out in the open again. There was a buzz of excitement around the table. I therefore invite you all, Mr. Fox went on, to stay here with me forever. Forever? They cried. My goodness, how marvelous! And Rabbit said to Mr. Rabbit, My dear, just think, we're never going to be shot again in our lives. We will make, said Mr. Fox, a little underground village with streets, houses, and each side separate houses for badgers and moles and rabbits and weasels and foxes. And every day I will go shopping for you all, and every day we eat like kings. The cheering that followed the speech went on for many minutes. Still waiting. Outside the foxhole, Boggies, Bounce, and Bean sat beside their tents with their guns on their laps. It was beginning to rain. Water was trickling down the necks of the 3 men into their shoes. He won't stay down there much longer now, Boogie said. The brute must be famished, Bruin said. That's right, said Mr. Bean. He'll be making a dash for it any moment. Keep your guns handy. They sat there by the hole waiting for the fox to come out, and so far as I know, they are still waiting. This was the book Fantastic Mr. Fox, written by Roald Dahl. The illustrations was made by Quentin Blake. If you feel now relaxed and chilled, then I'm happy to assist you with my ASMR clip here. I would be amazed if you like to follow, to subscribe, to like, and to leave a comment here in the comment section. That this little ASMR community can grow bigger and we can go together even further on the adventure of sound. My name is ASMR Katz, and I am a heavily tattooed red girl who like to satisfy you with the joy of ASMR. I am so happy that you have clicked on this video, and I hope you like this little story. And if you are curious, check out all the videos I have in stock for you to see what I have even more to offer. And wherever you are right now on this planet, I wish you a foxy time, and I hope you enjoy the feast of life the same as I do.